Page 47, and to another human being. As addicts, one of the biggest problems we have is telling the difference between our responsibility and the responsibilities of others. We blame ourselves for catastrophes over which we have no control. Conversely, we're often in complete denial about how we have hurt ourselves and others. We over-dramatize minor troubles and we shrug off major problems we should be taking a look at. If we're not sure what the exact nature of our wrongs is when we begin our first step, we'll know by the time we finish, because of making our admissions to another human being. What we can't see, our listener can, and he or she will help us sort out what we need to accept as our responsibility and what we don't. Most of us asked someone to be our sponsor before we began formally working the steps, and have been developing a relationship with that person ever since. For most of us, our sponsor will be another human being we choose to hear our fifth step. He or she will help us separate the things that were not our responsibility from those things that were. The relationship we've been building with our sponsor will give us the trust we need to have in him or her. The therapeutic value of one addict helping another is often powerfully demonstrated when our sponsor shares details from his or her own inventory as we share ours. This goes a long way toward reassuring us that we are not unique. The trust we must have in the person who is to hear our first step goes beyond simply being assured that he or she will keep our confidences. We need to trust that our listener can respond appropriately to what we are sharing. One of the primary reasons that so many of us find ourselves choosing our sponsor as the person who will listen to our fifth step is because he or she understands what we're doing and therefore knows just what kind of support we need during this process. Also, if our sponsor is a listener, it will help promote certain continuity when we work the following steps. Still, if for any reason we choose someone else to hear our fifth step admission, his or her qualifications are the same ones we would look for in our sponsor. An ability to be supportive without minimizing our responsibility, someone who can provide a steadying influence if we begin to feel overwhelmed during our fifth step. In short, someone with compassion, integrity, and insight. Questions. What qualities does my listener have that are attractive to me? How will his or her possession of these qualities help me make my admissions more effectively? Page 48. For most of us, developing an honest relationship is something new. We're very good at running away from relationships the first time someone tells us a painful truth. We're also good at having polite, distant interactions with no real depth. The fifth step helps us to develop honest relationships. We tell the truth about who we are, then, the hard part, we listen to the response. Most of us have been terrified of having a relationship like this. The fifth step gives us a unique opportunity to try such a relationship in a safe context. We can be pretty much assured that we won't be judged. Questions. Am I willing to trust the person who is to hear my fifth step? What do I expect from that person? How will working the fifth step help me to begin to develop new ways of having relationships? Next section, entitled The Exact Nature of Our Wrongs. Another way to ensure that our fifth step is not simply a reading of step 4 is to focus on what we are supposed to be admitting, the exact nature of our wrongs. There is a diversity of experience in our fellowship about what precisely is the exact nature of our wrongs. Most of us agree that, in working step 5, we should be focusing our attention on what's behind the patterns of our addiction and the reasons we acted out in the ways we did. Identifying the exact nature of our wrongs is often something that happens while we're sharing our inventory. Sometimes the repetition of the same type of situation will reveal the exact nature of that situation. Why do we, for example, keep choosing to involve ourselves with people who don't have our best interests at heart? Why do we keep approaching every relationship we have as though our very lives depended on having the upper hand? Why do we feel threatened by new experiences and so keep avoiding them? Finding the common thread in our own patterns will lead us right to the exact nature of our wrongs. At some point in this process, we will probably begin calling certain patterns of behavior our character defects. Though it won't be until the sixth step that we begin an in-depth examination of how each one of these defects plays a role in keeping us sick, it certainly won't hurt to allow this knowledge to begin forming in us now. Questions. How does the exact nature of my wrongs differ from my actions? Why do I need to admit the exact nature of my wrongs and not just the wrongs themselves? Section titled Spiritual Principles. Page 48. In the fifth step, we will focus on trust, courage, self-honesty, and commitment. Practicing the spiritual principle of trust is essential if we are to get through the fifth step. As mentioned above, we will probably have some experience with our sponsor that allows us to trust him or her enough to go ahead with this step. But what about the more profound issues that arise when wondering if working this step will really do any good? We have to trust the process as well as another person. The connection between the fifth step and our spiritual development isn't always clear to us. This doesn't mean that the connection is any less real, but it may make it harder for us to trust the process. Question: do I believe that working the fifth step will somehow make my life better? How? Courage is one principle we'll have to practice just to get started on this step. We'll probably need to continue drawing on our courage periodically throughout our work on this step. When we replace the phone on its hook, just as we are about to call our sponsor for an appointment to make our admissions, we're feeling fear and we need to practice courage. When we're sharing our inventory and we see a paragraph that we just can't tell anyone about, we need to face that moment of fear with courage and go ahead with sharing all of our inventory. When we've just shared something excruciatingly painful and our feelings of vulnerability are so overwhelming that we want to shut down before we hear what our sponsor has to say, we're at a defining moment in our recovery and we need to choose the courageous path. Doing so will influence the future course of our lives. Each time we feel fear, we remind ourselves that giving into it has rarely had anything but negative consequences in our lives, and doing so this time won't be any different. Such a reminder should be sufficient to motivate us to gather our courage. Questions: what are some of the ways in which I find the courage I need to work this step? How does practicing the principle of courage and working this step affect my whole recovery? Have I set a time and place for my fifth step? When and where? Practicing the principle of self-honesty is essential when we admit to ourselves the exact nature of our wrongs. Just as we mustn't disassociate ourselves from our emotions simply because we're afraid of our listener's response, so we can't afford to shut down our own reactions. We must allow ourselves to experience the natural and human reaction to the subject under discussion, our lives as addicts. Our lives have been sad. We've missed out on a lot because of our addiction. We've hurt people we loved because of our addiction. These realizations are painful. However, if we pay close attention, we'll probably recognize another feeling that's beginning to form in the wake of pain: hope. We finally stop using over our feelings, running away from our feelings, and shutting down because of our feelings. Now, for the first time, we have a chance to walk through our feelings, even the painful ones, with courage. Doing so will, in the long run, make us feel better about ourselves. This is one of the paradoxes that we often find in recovery. What begins in pain ends in joy and serenity. Page 50. Questions: how have I avoided self-honesty in the past? What am I doing to practice it now? How is a more realistic view of myself connected to humility? How does practicing the principle of self-honesty help me accept myself? The principle of commitment is demonstrated by the action we take in this step. Many of us have made so-called commitments in our lives, commitments which we had no intention of sticking to in tough times. Our commitments were made solely for the sake of convenience. With each step we've taken in the program of NA, we've deepened our real, practical commitment to the program. Getting a sponsor, working the steps, finding a home group, and going to its meetings, each one of these actions demonstrates that we're committed to our recovery in a practical, meaningful way. Question: how does sharing my inventory with my sponsor further my commitment to the NA program? Section entitled Moving On. One of the many benefits we get from working Step 5 is a sense of self-acceptance. We clearly recognize who we are today and accept ourselves without reservation. Just because we're lacking in certain areas doesn't mean we're worthless. We begin to see that we have both assets and defects. We're capable of great good and of inflicting great harm. There are aspects of our personalities that make us very special. Our experiences, even the negative ones, have often contributed to the development of the very best parts of us. For the first time, we're able to acknowledge that we're okay just as we are right at this moment. But accepting ourselves as we are today doesn't mean we can relax and stop striving for improvement. True self-acceptance includes accepting what we're lacking. It wouldn't be self-acceptance if we believed we had no further growing to do. It would be denial. So we acknowledge what we're lacking and we make a commitment to work on it. If we want to be more compassionate, we work on it by practicing the principle of compassion. If we want to be better educated, we take time to learn. If we want to have more friends, we take the time to develop our relationships. Question: how has working Step 5 increased my humility and self-acceptance? As we finish Step 5, we may feel a sense of relief. We've unburdened ourselves by sharing what we previously had put a lot of energy into, hiding or suppressing. It is true that our defects die in the light of exposure. Exposure to the light brings a sense of freedom that we feel no matter what the outer circumstances of our lives may be like. All of our relationships begin to change as a result of working this step. We especially need to acknowledge how much our relationships with ourselves, with a higher power, and with other people have changed. Questions, page 51. How has my relationship with a higher power changed as a result of working the fifth step? How has my relationship with my sponsor changed as a result of working the fifth step? How has my view of myself changed as a result of working this step? To what extent have I developed love and compassion for myself and others? Along with a sense of relief, our weariness with our character defects has probably reached a peak. This will translate easily into a state of being entirely ready, just what we need to begin Step 6.